The concept of taking an extra turn in a game is a very powerful move, but in the newest Magic the Gathering decks, have they gone too far? Hello and welcome. I am Cindershadow, and I am a YouTuber that has done this now for quite a while. This is actually episode 151 of This Week in Magic. I can't believe I've made this many episodes of it. But today we got to talk about an upcoming ban announcement that we know is just on the horizon. The World's Tournament is this weekend for Magic the Gathering. If you don't play the game, it is probably one of the most popular games of existence. It's the game that's been around since 93. This is a 27-year-old game that is still going quite strong, but in the recent years we've seen nothing but bannings, we've seen nothing but their fire design, which is like they're building it from the top down, build all the more powerful cards and then fill in the slots, and it makes a very uniqueness for it. They're not building to the lore that we once knew. There used to be novels and everything in the game, but recently there is in the standard format, because the Worlds comes up. This comes up once a year where people from around the globe sit there and play this game, and they play for cash prizes upwards, I think, of up to $1 million at one point, but that has been scaled back. I think now they just get an entry fee, and they still dependent on their placing, much like golf tournaments. They get paid out dependent on where they place. So I think ultimately they make money just for playing the game and showing up and making a appearance in the World Tournament, and so it's well worth it and worthwhile for people to follow along. And if you're an aspiring person that wants to sit there and play these card games, Magic the Gathering is one of those possibilities at a very young age that you could turn around and make leaps and bounds in this game that no one has seen before. Now, the problem that we do see is we just had rotation, and rotation is where a bunch of sets leave the current format, and then they leave only so many sets and one additional set that gets brought out at that time. Now, with this rotation, things tend to take a little bit for the meta to self-adjust. There's certain decks that people are going to play, and when they play these decks, certain cards filter themselves to the top. And what has gone on today is we have two cards to really look at, and we're going to break them down quite a bit and see, really, do these need to be banned? How is the format reacting? And why has it gone that way? Probably the easiest way to show you why this is such a big deal is we look at the decks. We've got many decks here. We have, how many is this? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 decks out of it's 6, 12, 16. So it's a top 16. And so 11 of these decks in the top 16 are running one of these problematic cards. And that problematic card is Alun's Emphony. I'm sorry if I pronounce that wrong. You guys can all blast me in the comments about it, because I know you guys always love that I mispronounce everything. For 7 mana, you get to create 2 1/1 blue bird creature tokens with flying. Then you get to take an extra turn after this one, and you exile Alun's Emphony when that happens, when that spell resolves. There's also a foretell cost that makes it 1 mana cheaper, and to foretell you can pay 2 during your turn, anytime during your turn, and you put it into an exile zone. The problem with that, I said this back when foretell became a thing, is now you cannot hit these cards in a hand disruption deck. So if you're playing duress, if you're playing things that actually affect your opponent's hand, this can evade that, because now they can put it to the side and you cannot hit that thing that's in their hand. So it is very beneficial if you end up against a deck that's doing a lot of hand disruption, that you can foretell this and put it to the side, and then you can cast it whenever you need to later on when you have the mana to do that. And so it protects itself. The spell protects itself. You would probably see a lot more decks rise to the top that would actually affect this and actually turn around and say, no, listen, you're not going to do this. You're not going to be able to cast the spell because I'm going to make you pitch the spell. But it protects itself. And that was one of the things that I said when I first saw Foretell, was this is going to make things very interesting. It's possibly a solution against hand disruption, but at the same time, that hand disruption, now you cannot affect this. So previously, if there was hand disruption without the Foretell, you'd be able to get rid of this thing. And this deck, I can tell you right now, would not have risen to the top if it wasn't for that Foretell aspect. It would still be viable, but it wouldn't be as high at that point. There's other cards in this particular one. You got Burn Down the House, which is a board wipe. You've got Memory Deluge, which actually sits there and rifles through your deck, finding more cards. This one's in this particular deck that I brought up here from the Worlds, actually runs the Salitas, which that card in itself may become problematic after bannings. I can tell you right now, there is a way to tap and untap this infinite times right now in Standard, but no one's playing it because the deck isn't fast enough. These decks, they have enough control and enough speed to get down your lands, and forcing turns to go the way they do, so then it just makes it a lot easier, and that's part of it. Leer in this particular one, where people are going this route, spells cannot be countered. Each instant and sorcery card in your graveyard has flashback. The flashback cost is equal to the card's mana cost. So this, once again, also gets rid of that hand disruption stuff. So if this was in your graveyard, you'd be able to cast it anyways. So there's a lot going on here. The idea is you get up to a lunge infamy, you're able to do a galvanic laceration, and you can then cast your next instant or sorcery spell. You get to copy it, so then you take 2 turns, and you take multiple turns over and over and over again. There's so many cards here that let you dig deep. If you're taking 2 turns, you're pretty much locking your opponent out, and that is why this deck is such a problem. If you think back to the days of Nexus of Fate, if anyone that was around for those days, the card could be infinitely looped in your deck and you could take turns non-stop. At least this still exiles itself. However, I remember the days back when I used to play my friends, and they started building up these much more powerful decks, and at one point I ran out and I went the tribal route and I built an elf deck. Now, the elf deck wasn't a traditional mono green deck. I actually built it with black and blue, and so it was black, blue, and green, and I was able to actually come up with a significant combo at this time with a Dynamic Tutor, a Regrowth, Gaia's Blessing, and Time Warp. And with those 4 cards, I was able to loop it, always be able to search for the card I needed, and then I just had what was on board. It just created triggers and mana, and I was able to do whatever I wanted. But at that time, I would lock out my opponents, and it would lock them out to the point that we didn't want to play that anymore, and I had to actually dismantle that deck because it wasn't fun. It stopped being fun to play that type of deck, and at the time, I was more just trying to compete at their power level at the time, and because they had a lot more money than me and were able to buy cards and able to actually afford to build these powerful decks, because they used to buy booster boxes where I'd buy like a booster because I wouldn't be able to build that. And now, the moral of that story is I think that's made me a much better player ultimately in Magic the Gathering, because I've always had the limited format, and when I draft and play sealed, I can build and recognize things that I can build with a very limited pool. Where a lot of people, they turn around and they build things with the unlimited pool, and they can actually take their resources and make something more of it. And that is another thing that's going on with these decks. These decks are upwards to like $300 if you were to build them in paper, and a lot of that has to do with the mana base. And I gotta say, the mana bases that we're dealing with in Magic the Gathering right now is way too efficient. When the pathways were announced, I also said that those are a mistake. They're going to make things very easy to adjust your mana bases so your mana bases don't matter. At least with the sets that we lost, the mana base has been knocked down a couple notches, but these pathways, you just run 8 of them and you've got access to 3 colors. Like, that's what I don't like about the pathways. They don't have the drawback that they should. I suspect, now that we've seen how these mana bases sit, I suspect that these will, after rotation, start to gain value very quickly. Ultimately, is the Infinity the problem? Well, this card wasn't really a problem until rotation. So the cards became a lot more stale and a lot easier to build these decks because you don't have a giant pool to disrupt these. You could turn around and make an all counters deck, and there is in particular one deck that is kind of that way, and that is the blue-white one here. This one, I am going to guess, is going to make its way through and actually surprise a lot of people, because this has been built around taxing these cards to make them a lot harder to cast them, and including the certain counter spells that are in here, they kind of give you a little bit more of a glimmer of hope being able to break it down. However, this deck is also running a Lund's Infinity, and that in itself, they're only running a 1-of. And that 1-of, I actually have played around with this deck, and that 1-of makes a giant difference. Literally, all you do is you fuddle around until you draw into this card. Once you draw into this card, in most cases, you have enough of a board state and enough of counter magic that you can turn around and cast the extra turn, and that's your finisher, is the extra turn. Where in all these other decks, the extra turns are just to lock out your opponent till they're dead. Where this one extra turn in this deck finishes you off, and that is probably why we're going to see this card get banned. It has become too versatile. The other things that I would like to see banned, probably Hall of the Storm Giants. This card is absolutely ridiculous. These manlands need to go away. They're probably one of the worst things right now in the format. And the one thing I'm not seeing in a lot of these decks is they're not running Field of Ruin. I just went to the wrong area. We'll go back to the worlds. I'm not seeing a lot of Field of Ruins in these decks at the same time, and Field of Ruin gets rid of these, and that's what you got to run. No one's running land destruction in these top decks, which I'm very surprised about. The other card that people are wanting to be banned is Eska's Chariot. Now, I don't think this card is that big of a deal. It's what it does can be that big of a deal. It's a 4-mana legendary artifact vehicle, so you have to be able to crew it, and unfortunately having that drawback with the crew is a big deal. Now, when it enters the battlefield, it makes 2 kitty cat tokens, and those cats then can crew the Chariot. So it does come in with the way that it can crew, so because of that, it makes it quite powerful. But it's when it attacks, you create a token that is a copy of a target token you control. And the reason why that is such a big deal right now, honestly, is Ren N7. Reveal that, so the Ren N7 part is -3. Create a green tree folk creature token with reach, and this creature's power and toughness are equal to the number of lands you control. So the idea is you have Eska's Chariot, the next turn you put down a Ren N7, then you able to create this tree folk, and then the Chariot attacks. Because it's a token on the board, you then copy the tree folk, so then you're with 2 separate tree folk. Does this really constitute a ban? This is a very gimmicky thing. I don't think Eska's Chariot is that bad. I think Ren N7 is a lot worse for what he does. There's a much other problematic cards in the format right now, like Werewolf Pack Leader. That card is insane and shouldn't have been printed. 2 mana for a 3/3 that becomes a 5/3 and can draw you cards. For 2 mana, that is insane. This card to me is more powerful than anything else in this deck. Even though these two cards are more expensive in the mana cost, the Werewolf Pack Leader is just a problem. It should not exist. It shouldn't have existed. I think this was a big mistake when it comes to what value you get for 2 mana. Now, yeah, it's 2 green, but that means you're building mono green around it. But once again, the mana bases in these formats doesn't mean you have to sit there and build mono green. If you were to ban Eska's Chariot, what happens to this deck? Nothing. This deck stays. The Eska's Chariot doesn't do anything to the deck. I don't think it would significantly lower the power of the deck. I honestly think this card won't do anything ultimately in getting rid of it. If anything, you get rid of Ren and 7, but at the same time, that's not that big of a deal. I think with a little, I've seen quite a few decks that compete against this one. One being the mono white deck, I think has a lot of easier flow against this deck. There's a lot of decks that can take this down. However, this deck tends to fare well against the Izzet and the Alun's Emphany. It does enough damage quickly and can get through, and it is sustainable a little bit longer term. So even if they are able to get off 1 or 2 turns, this deck tends to just out survive it and tends to just build up over time even worse, and it just takes over the game very easily. But ultimately, I don't see this beating those Izzet decks. I don't see them beating the taking turns when it does come down to it. I think there's a lot more value in these cards. This one that I just opened up here doesn't even run creatures in it. This is a all damage one, and your creatures are going to be the Emphany and the Hall of Storm Giants. They're just running the Manland and that, and never should you be able to win where you're not actually running creatures. And this is, I think, one of the main reasons why this card does need a ban. But I think if they're going to ban this, they should ban something else like the Hall of the Storm Giants, because you can still muddle around and still have this card. And I still think Hall of the Storm Giants will become very problematic even without this. This one in particular does run the Field of Ruin, which I would highly suggest any of them, if they were running Field of Ruin, that they're going to have a better chance running that. Like, once again, here's another one we opened up. It's just the same decks over and over again. Now, in particular, when it comes to these sort of decks, the one I do like is the Dragons and Treasures, where you're making a lot of treasures. This one's a little bit more out there. They're doing a lot of open sort of things. The Smoldering Egg is probably a decent card to throw in there. It's something that just kind of sits on the field, and then at the opportune moment, it does flip over to a 4/4 dragon that just does a lot of damage. The Goldspan Dragon, I found, is a much bigger threat when it comes down to it. This card has been a dominant card since it was released in Keldheim, and I think that's going to be another powerhouse if Emphany does get banned. I think Goldspan Dragon does take over the format even worse than it has right now. Now, ultimately, what happens here? You get rid of Emphany, what happens to this deck? Do they lose their win con? No, the deck is still viable, but it does lower that power down of the deck. You could easily put something else in here that could just make more mana. I think ultimately the deck would still survive, but it definitely would bring the power level down in the deck to the point where it just doesn't do the win and win more scenario. Other things that we're seeing here, we saw the white blue, and then there's a couple mono white decks that are out there, and these mono white decks are a decent aggro style deck. Ultimately, are they going to hold up against it? I have tried and played around with a little bit of the mono white, but it just, to me, doesn't hold up against the taking turns. I think the taking turns just gets through a lot. And once again, we've got Manlands here. So if the taking turns easily adjust with some Field of Ruins, these decks will fall apart pretty quick. A couple board wipe decks. I've seen some board wipe decks out there on Arena, and they just fall apart to them. So that is the problem I see with the mono white, is they have a giant glaring weakness. It's just that they're faster against these particular cards. So the meta has been warped by the mono green and the blue Emphany card. It has been warped by that, and because of those cards, you're now having to play other things that are going to be able to take them down quicker. So that in itself is another reason that it will need to be banned. Now, the one thing that stands out here is this red-green treasures style deck where you're making a lot of treasures. The Eska's Chariot once again is in there, Goldspan Dragon. Magda, I was running a dwarf and dragons version of making treasures, and it worked out very well. With Magda, the extra thing of sacrifice 5 treasures, search your library for an artifact or dragon card, put that card into the battlefield, then shuffle, makes it very interesting because you could turn around and sacrifice those 5 treasures to get an Eska's Chariot or to get a Goldspan Dragon. So it does make it very interesting in that sense. I used to run this where I'd be able to sack them and get an Embercleave, but getting those 5 treasures was never really that easy, and it didn't really go that crazy. Now this one's running to negate, and that just goes to show you what the format has done. The format has warped so much that now decks are having to just splash that blue in order to counter taking turns. That's where we're at. You need a way to counter these decks, and that shouldn't be. That really is warping the way the current standard meta is, and it needs to be taken down. So I do guess Emphany will get a large ban here. I think the card will need to go. When it was released, I said, oh great, here we go again with Nexus of Fate. It's going to be a repeat of that, because we know, most of us that have been playing this game for many a time, we know when a taking turns card comes out and it's powerful, and it doesn't matter the amount of mana that you put into these spells or amount of restrictions you put into them. Taking turns just makes the decks that much more difficult to play against, and it does warp the format, and that is what we're seeing here. And this card has warped the format to the point that it will need to be taken down a notch and will need to be banned. Now, all of that said, really, when it comes down to it, this is the world. I've seen an increase and an uptick since these decks were released online. I've seen an increase and an uptick of the play with these decks, and it makes it very difficult to sit there and want to play Magic the Gathering quite often, because I like playing the game. I am branching out. I am looking at Flesh and Blood. I am looking at other games and looking at other video games in particular to play when all of this is going on, and it makes it very difficult to sit there and want to play this game day in, day out, day in, day out. There's no value in my return. There's no value in spending my time right now in playing Arena, mostly because we've seen the warp of the meta. Now, I could go and turn to Historic and play one of the other formats, and I just don't like playing Historic because they have added way too many cards that are broken to the format, and it's time and time again, it becomes a coin flip when you play Historic. Either you get matched up against a deck that you're outright going to beat, or you get matched up against a deck that's outright going to beat you, and that coin flip with the way the matchmaking system works in Arena just does not make it fun for me, and it doesn't make it fun for a lot of people out there that play the game. We keep returning to the game mostly because it's what we know, it's what we're good at. A lot of us that play have fun playing, and we would much rather play our friends than have to deal with this swath of bad and horrible decisions by Wizards of the Coast with their cards. And the being shy to take down certain cards and to ban them outright, it really does affect the state of the game. It really does affect the way the game plays forward, and I hope going forward they turn around and are able to ban things or not make these cards outright too powerful like they have done in the past. They've done this lots in the past. We have seen a little slide down in the power level, which is nice, and it is giving a few of us hope that soon, very soon, Magic the Gathering might be playable once again. Anyway, this is your proud Canadian Phoenix signing off. Don't forget to like and subscribe. I do this video. I try to do it once a week. And until next time, you guys have a great day. Let me know down below what you think of the bannings that are on the horizon.